I have a quick question. Just a quick question here. Anybody here not eaten dinner? A lot of you. Of you who have not eaten dinner, is there anybody who's particularly hungry? Who's hungry? You're hungry? How hungry are you? Very hungry. What's your first name? Jonathan. Jonathan, you're very hungry. So what I've done is I got you a ham and cheese sandwich and a, what is this? Something liquid. So here you go. Here you go for Jonathan. There you go, because you're hungry. All right, now. What we have seen there is a form of motivation, right? So that's motivation in action right there. That Jonathan just demonstrated one of our drives. Human beings are a mix of drives. That's one of them. We have a biological drive. We eat when we're hungry. We drink when we're thirsty. We have sex to satisfy our carnal urges, right? That's part of what it means to be human. That is a part of what it means to be human. Agreed? Okay. But that's not all it is to be human. Humans are not merely their biological drives, right? Except for maybe young men between 15 and 17. But humans are more than simply their biological drive. We're more complex than that, okay? We have other drives. So let me see if I can demonstrate that here. No.
Don't forget we're English.
Yeah, no, I was thinking about that. How about you? What's your first name? No, it's not. Jonathan. All right. Jonathan 2. We'll call you Jonathan 2. Here, I have a proposition for you. All right, Jonathan 2. Here's the proposition. I want you to listen to it, and you can agree or disagree. If you come up here on stage and hold this book to that camera right back there for 30 seconds, I'll give you 10 pounds. All right, there you go. Here we go. Yeah. Okay. So there you go. Hold it up there, right to that camera, because it's being webcast, okay?
Okay.
You with it? All right. All right. A little more enthusiasm there, Jonathan. All right. A little more activity. I know you're... Okay, come on. That's a little too grudging. Just come on. And don't cover up the title either. All right. Go up there. There you go. Little activity. All right. Okay. And then, I guess, show it to that camera too, right back there, if you would. Okay. So we're at about 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. One more over that camera. 4, 3, 2. I'm counting. 1. All right, here you go. Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you.
All right. Now, what we've seen there is another human motivation, right? We respond exquisitely to rewards and punishments in our environment. And it's too bad that there wasn't a camera here, because when I made the offer of 10 quid for this thing, Jonathan suddenly perked up. And what was interesting is that a few others of you, some people over here were encouraging him on. Others of you were actually volunteering in the hopes that he would reject the offer and you would do it, all right? So this shows we respond exquisitely to rewards and punishments in our environment. Typically, if you reward something, you get more of the behavior. You punish something, you get less of the behavior, right? Okay, that makes sense. That's part of what it is to be human. But that's not all it is to be human. We're not simply the Jonathan 1 drive and the Jonathan 2 drive. We're more complex than that. We have a third drive. We do things because they're interesting. We do things because we like them, because they're inherently gratifying. We do things because we get better at them, because they're the right thing to do, or because they make a contribution, or they're part of some kind of larger purpose, right? We have that drive. Agreed? Yeah. Okay? Most general consensus, but not a complete consensus there. So for those of you who might be skeptical of that claim about this third drive, I have a question for you, which is this. What are you doing here? No, I mean that very seriously. I mean that. Think about this for a second. Think about your own motivation here. This is an extraordinarily attractive audience. But my guess is that in the next hour, no one will find a mate. Okay? You're not going to satisfy your biological drive. Second, in the next hour, nobody but this Jonathan is going to make any money, right? So why are you here? Well, you're here because you're curious. You're here because you want to learn. You're here because you're part of a community. You're here because you want to engage. And that third drive is an extraordinarily powerful motivator for human beings. But the problem, as I see it, is that, and the animating idea behind this book, is that in our businesses, too often, we've stopped at that second Jonathan drive and said, well, no. What really motivates people is this elaborate system of rewards and punishments. And otherwise, they wouldn't do anything. And that turns out to be wrong. We can argue whether it's wrong morally. It's an interesting conversation to have. It's actually wrong empirically. For this book, I looked at about 40 or 50 years of research in human behavior, human motivation, that really calls into question whether we should be running our businesses by that Jonathan 2 drive. I want to tell you a little bit about some of the science and then show you some examples of companies around the world that are charting a different path, okay? Because the science is really surprising. The science is a little bit freaky, okay? We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think. I want to give you, there's a whole set of unbelievably interesting studies. I want to give you two that call into question this idea that if you reward something, you get more of the behavior you want. If you punish something, you get less of it. So let's go from London to the mean streets of Cambridge, Massachusetts, in the northeastern part of the United States. And let's talk about a study done at MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Here's what they did. They took a whole group of students, and they gave them a set of challenges. Things like memorizing strings of digits, solving word puzzles, other kinds of spatial puzzles, even physical tasks like throwing a ball through a hoop. Okay, they gave them these challenges, and they said to incentivize their performance, they gave them 3 levels of rewards. Okay? So if you did pretty well, you got a small monetary reward. If you did medium well, you got a medium monetary reward. And if you did really well, if you were one of the top performers, you got a large cash prize. Okay? We've seen this movie before. This is essentially a typical motivation scheme within organizations, right? We reward the very top performers, we ignore the low performers, and the other folks kind of in the middle. Okay, you get a little bit. So what happens? They do the test, they have these incentives. Here's what they found out. One, this is the first one. I have 2 examples. One of my very helpful slides right here. 1, as long as the task involved only mechanical skill, bonuses worked as they would be expected. The higher the pay, the better their performance. Okay, that makes sense. But here's what happens. But once the task called for even rudimentary cognitive skill, think about that for a second. This is the phrase, rudimentary cognitive skill. Their phrase, not mine. I would never write that. Rudimentary cognitive skill. A larger reward led to poorer performance. Now, this is strange, right? A larger reward led to poorer performance? How can that possibly be? Now, what's interesting about this is that these folks here who did this are all economists, 2 at MIT, 1 at the University of Chicago, 1 at Carnegie Mellon, okay? The top tier of the economics profession. And they're reaching this conclusion that seems contrary to what a lot of us learned in economics, which is that the higher the reward, the better their performance. And they're saying that once you get above rudimentary cognitive skill, it's the other way around. Which seems like this kind of, the idea that these rewards don't work that way seems vaguely left-wing and socialist, doesn't it? It's kind of this kind of weird socialist conspiracy. For those of you who have those conspiracy theories, I want to point out the notoriously left-wing socialist group that financed the research, the Federal Reserve Bank. So this is the mainstream of the mainstream coming to a conclusion that's quite surprising, seems to defy the laws of behavioral physics. Okay? Now, the other question I have for you, if you think about your own work, is how many of you in your jobs, how many of you have jobs that require rudimentary cognitive skill or higher? Actually, it's only about, yeah, it's only about, he was trying to figure out what rudimentary meant. It was only actually about 75% of the audience, which is a little bit alarming here. So this is strange. It's strange finding. So what do? They say, this is freaky, they say. Okay? They don't say this is freaky. They say this is anomalous. They say this is freaky. Let's go test it somewhere else. Maybe that $50 or $60 prize isn't sufficiently motivating for an MIT student, right? So let's go to a place where $50 is actually more significant relatively. All right, so let's take the experiment. We're going to go to Madurai, India, rural India, where $50, $60, whatever the number was, is actually a significant sum of money. So they replicated the experiment in India roughly as follows. Small rewards, the equivalent of 2 weeks' salary. Small performance, low performance, 2 weeks' salary. Medium performance, about a month's salary. High performance, about 2 months' salary. Okay, so those are real good incentives. Okay, so you're going to get a different result here. Well, what happened, though, was that the people offered the medium reward did no better than the people offered the small reward. But this time around, the people offered the top reward. They did worst of all. In 8 of the 9 tasks we examined across 3 experiments, higher incentives led to worse performance. Now, this is really weird. We're going to talk a little bit more about why this is, but what's interesting about this is that it actually isn't all that anomalous. This has been replicated over and over and over again by psychologists, by some extent by sociologists, and by economists, over and over and over again. For simple, straightforward tasks, those kinds of incentives, if you do this, then you get that, they're great. For tasks that are algorithmic, set of rules where you have to just follow along and get a right answer, if-then rewards, carrots and sticks, outstanding. But when the task gets more complicated, when it requires some conceptual, creative thinking, those kinds of motivators demonstrably don't work. They don't work. So let's talk about rewards. Punishments are always more effective, right? Punishments are more effective. Let's talk about punishments. And this would be number 2 in my example. See? 2. Let's go to Israel, to a group of Israeli daycare centers. Israeli daycare centers. At these Israeli daycare centers, parents are required to pick up their kids by 4 in the afternoon. If they don't pick up the kids at 4 in the afternoon, the caregiver has to stay late. So what they notice is that several parents are coming late. Some parents are coming late, not a huge number, but enough to be annoying. Some parents are coming late. So, of course, what do you do to deter the lateness? Charge them, absolutely. That's the Anglo-Saxon way, right? We charge them. So they say, let's charge them. So they put up this sign. See how straightforward it is? Announcement, fine for coming late, okay? As you all know, the official closing time of the daycare center is 4 o'clock every afternoon. Since some parents have been coming late, we, with the approval of the Authority for Private Daycare Centers in Israel, have decided to impose a fine on parents who come late to pick up their children. As of next Sunday, a fine of 10 Israeli shekels will be charged every time a child is collected after 4:10. This fine will be calculated monthly, blah, 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 blah. So basically, that's about $6 US. So each time, each kid, so if you have 2 kids and they show up late, and you show up late that day, that's $12 right there. Each time, each kid. Okay, so obviously we know what's going to happen. You charge them, and what happens? After the introduction of the fine, we observed a steady increase in the number of parents coming late. The rate finally settled at a level that was higher and almost twice as high as the initial one. Now, that's kind of peculiar. How do we explain that? Time is money. They can make more money at work. Oh, let's turn it on its head a little bit. Why were parents showing up on time in the first place? They didn't think they had a choice? Okay, that's an interesting way to put it. They feel guilty. They don't want to inconvenience the nursery workers. Why? Because they have a relationship with the nursery worker, and they're doing something that is not nice to the nursery worker by making that person stay late. And this is a person whom they care about because that person is caring for their children. When you take it out of that realm and put a price on it, then it's just another bag of potato crisps. You know, you can buy whatever you want. And so what happened here is that it became a pure transaction, so people can just buy more of it, and so there's no moral obligation. And then what's interesting is once they realized they'd made a mistake and they stopped the fine, the level of lateness stayed up. Because people had essentially habituated themselves to that. So what this shows us is that, so this is kind of weird. The behavioral physics is not the same as Newtonian physics. Behavioral physics, sometimes if you reward something, you get less of the behavior you want. And sometimes when you punish it, you get more of the behavior you don't want. It's very strange. We're much more complicated than that. So let's talk about, that leads me to this company right here. We're going to talk about some company examples. I want to lead with this company right here. This is a Cambridge company, Redgate Software. Any of you heard of this company? A handful of you have heard of this company. They did something very interesting. I'm going to use this as a prelude to talk about some of the company examples. They have a sales force. How do we compensate a sales force? What do we do? Bonuses, commissions. Okay, so you know what they did? They eliminated commissions for their sales force. You like that idea or no? You like that idea, okay. It's a strange idea. No one ever does that. They eliminated commissions for their sales force. Now that makes people a little bit uneasy. So how are they going to sell? Why would they have any incentive to sell stuff? Well, what happened? They eliminate commissions for their sales force, and lo and behold, sales go up. Salespeople end up being more collaborative. Managers spend less time policing salespeople and who gets what, and more time actually trying to help the customer. And the instigating idea behind this, one of the founders of this company said that they had worked with various kinds of sales compensation schemes throughout the short life of this company, and they found that none of them worked. They were all gameable. And so they said, wait a second. Our previous sales salary system felt like a giant, complex, and medieval spirograph centered on an assumption that wasn't true. And here's the assumption that wasn't true. And the assumption that wasn't true is really the key here. The assumption is that human beings are fundamentally inert and passive. But if we didn't have a carrot dangling in front of us or a stick being wheeled over us, we would not do anything. There are a lot of people who believe that. The curious thing is that no one ever believes that about him or herself. They only believe it about other people. And that is the wrong starting assumption. That is not human nature. Human nature is to be active and engaged. Human nature is to be active and engaged. And if you don't believe me, find me a 2-year-old who's not active and engaged. Find me a 4-year-old who's not active and engaged. That's, to use a computer metaphor, that's how we are out of the box. That's the default setting when the box ships. Now, I think for a lot of people, something changes the default, but that's how we are fundamentally. And if you begin with that assumption, it leads you to different places. Then if you layer in this research on human motivation, you realize that the second flawed assumption is that the only way to get good performance is to reward what you want and punish what you don't want. And that's just not true. Now, let's talk about what does work. Let's take a few minutes to talk about what does work. Here we go. Start with this one. Fact, money is a motivator. And you know this is a fact because I wrote fact. See that? Fact, money is a motivator at work. But in a slightly strange way. If you don't pay people enough, they won't be motivated. People are exquisitely attuned. Compensation research shows that people are exquisitely attuned to fairness in pay. If people are being paid unfairly, if they're not being compensated adequately, if they feel like they're getting a raw deal, if they are having a hard time supporting their family, all this talk about the third drive is nonsense. It doesn't even enter the conversation. But once you do that, once you pay people enough, this third drive matters a heck of a lot, almost incalculably more to high performance. What's curious about, there's another paradox here, which is that the best use of money as a motivator is to pay people enough to take the issue of money off the table. Pay people enough so that they're not thinking about money and they're thinking about the work. Now, once you do that, it turns out there are 3 factors that the science shows lead to better performance, not to mention personal satisfaction. Autonomy, mastery, and purpose. Autonomy, mastery, and purpose. I'll spend a few minutes talking about these things here. Let's start with autonomy. Autonomy is our desire to be self-directed, to direct our own lives. Now, in many ways, traditional notions of management run afoul of that. Management is about control. The goal of management in general is compliance. And compliance is a very worthy goal if you're doing simple things. But management, what we forget about management is that management is a technology. It's something some guy invented in the 1850s. Okay? There are very few technologies that were invented in the 1850s that we're still using today. British railroads being one, but the very few technologies that were invented in 1850 that we're using today. Management is great if you want compliance, but if you want engagement, which is what we want in the workforce today as people are doing more complicated, sophisticated things, self-direction is better. Let me give you some examples of this, of almost radical forms of self-direction in the workplace that lead to good results. Let's start with this company right here, Atlassian, an Australian company. It's a software company, and they do something really cool. Once a quarter on a Thursday afternoon, they say to their developers, for the next 24 hours, you can work on anything you want. You can work on it the way you want. You can work on it with whomever you want. All we ask is that you show the results to the company at the end of those 24 hours in this fun kind of meeting, not a star chamber session, but this fun meeting with beer and cake and fun and other things like that. I don't know what that is. But it's a fun meeting. That's my point, all right? It's not a severe meeting. There's beer. There's cake. There are Australians. It's awesome. It turns out that that one day of pure, undiluted autonomy has led to a whole array of fixes for existing software, a whole array of ideas for new products that otherwise had never emerged. One day. Now, this is not an if-then incentive. This is not the sort of thing that I would have done 3 years ago before I knew this research. I would have said, you want people to be creative and innovative? Give them a frickin' innovation bonus. If you do something cool, I'll give you $2,500. They're not doing this at all. They're essentially saying, you probably want to do something interesting. Let me just get out of your way. One day of autonomy produces things that had never emerged. Let me give you another. They call these things, by the way, they call these things FedEx days, because you have to deliver something overnight. Australian humor. It's an interesting idea, and they've taken it to another level, which I'll explain in a moment. Let me give you another example here, because I don't want to limit this to, while third drive is really important for complex creative work, I actually think it can apply to almost any kind of work. And there's a really brilliant example of it from this company right here called Zappos. Zappos is an online shoe company, and they run call centers. Now, if any of you have ever worked at a call centers are unpleasant places. Some of you are nodding here. Good, to confirm that. Have you worked in a call center?
No, but we produce software for call centers.
Oh, okay, you produce software for call centers. So you're responsible for making them terrible places to work. Thank you. They're terrible places to work, typically, not everyone. Here's what it looks like if you've ever been to one. It's basically this warren of cubicles, hamster-like cubicles where people are sitting there at their desks with headsets on. A call comes in. You listen to the call. You type something in. You call up a script on your screen, and you read the script. It's algorithmic, routine, rule-based kind of work. Your calls are monitored often. Your calls are timed. Okay? It's not a pleasant place to work. In the US, turnover in call centers, annual turnover in call centers is nearly 100%. Annual turnover is 100%. So if you were to come back, January 27th, 2011, there would be, on average, entirely new people there. I mean, it's basically treating people like light bulbs. Light bulb burns out, take it off, take a new one off the shelf, screw it. Zappos decides to throw out the book on how you run a call center. Here's what they do. 2 weeks of training. Then at the end of the 2 weeks of training, they do this weird incentive thing where they say, if you want to leave right now, I'll pay you $2,000. Kind of a negative carrot. Or I don't even know what it is. It's a filter. It's a way, probably anybody who leaves for $2,000 is going to cost you more than $2,000 in the long run. So they use that as a filter. Then they say to their call center representatives, go to your desk, arrange it however you want. When a call comes in, here's your job. Solve the customer's problem. That's it. Solve the customer's problem. Do it your way, no script, no timing, no monitoring. If it takes you 1 minute, cool. If it takes you 1 hour, that's fine too. It's crazy. Zappos comes out of nowhere to have one of the highest customer service ratings in America, higher than the Four Seasons, by taking this job that we thought as inherently soul-hollowing, deadening, and enlivening it with some autonomy. Let's go to another example, 20% time. Atlassian said, these FedEx days are working so well, we're going to go to 20% time, where people can spend 20% of their time working on anything they want. This is done famously, as you might know, at Google. Now, Google has done this for a few years. Google doesn't sign away the intellectual property rights to what's created during that time, which is a smart thing. How many of you have looked at Google News in the last week? Anybody? Okay, Google News, which has reshaped the American newspaper business, not an official project, a 20% project. Anybody have a Gmail account? Oh, my gosh. Gmail, not an official project, a 20% project. Here's what one Google engineer says. Just about all the good ideas here have bubbled up from 20% time. which makes you wonder what they're doing the other 80% of the time, but that's another story. All right, let's talk about mastery. Mastery is our urge to get better at stuff. We like to get better at stuff. This is why people play musical instruments on the weekend. You got all these people who are acting in ways that seem irrational economically. They play musical instruments on weekends. Why? It's not going to get them a mate. It's not going to make them any money. Why are they doing it? Because it's fun, because you get better at it, and that's satisfying. There are a couple of interesting examples of this. I'll just give you many interesting examples. I'll just give you two very quickly here. First, let's talk about open source, the open source movement. Open source, as many of you know, is people around the world who create software for free and give away their product. Okay? Now that seems today unremarkable, but go back in time a little bit. I imagine this if I went to my first economics professor, a woman named Mary Alice Schulman, and I went to her in 1983 and said, Professor Schulman, can I talk to you after class for a moment? Yeah. I got this inkling. I got this idea for a business model. I just want to run it past you. Here's how it would work. You get a bunch of people around the world who are doing highly skilled work, but they're willing to do it for free and volunteer their time, 20, sometimes 30 hours a week. Okay, she's looking at you somewhat skeptically there. Oh, but I'm not done. And then what they create, they give it away rather than sell it. It's going to be huge. I mean, she truly would have thought I was insane. Okay? It seemed to fly in the face of so many things. But what do you have? You have Linux powering 1 out of 4 corporate servers in Fortune 500 companies, Apache powering more than the majority of web servers, Wikipedia. What's going on? Why are people doing this? Why are these people, many of whom are technically sophisticated, highly skilled people who have jobs? Okay? They have jobs. They're working at jobs for pay, doing sophisticated technological work. And yet, during their limited discretionary time, they do equally, if not more, technically sophisticated work, not for their employer, but for someone else for free. That's a strange economic behavior. Economists who look into it, why are they doing this? It's overwhelmingly clear. Challenge and mastery, along with making a contribution. That's it. That urge for mastery is so powerful that people will take their limited discretionary time to do the basically similar work that they do to get paid for, but do it for free. There's also, in this month's Harvard Business Review, was a great long-term study of worker motivation, where they had workers keep diaries for several, over the course of a couple of years, to sort of measure what are people's motivations at work. It turned out overwhelmingly there was one top motivator, and that motivator was this: making progress was the top motivator by far. And not dramatic progress always. A little bit of progress, getting a little bit better, doing something a little bit better. That was, not even close, the top motivator at work. And what was curious about this, these Harvard researchers said, is that the key to motivation doesn't depend on elaborate incentive systems. In fact, the people in our study rarely mentioned incentives. That was really motivating them at work was getting a little bit better, mastery. Let's go to the last one. Purpose. Autonomy, mastery, and purpose. We want to be part of something larger than ourselves. And I think that urge has been powerful enough to, in many ways, kind of reshape traditional categories. I think there's a reshaping of the categories of work and business going on now, driven in part by this desire for purpose. Let me give you one quick example of this. Another example. Company operates here in the UK, based in the United States. Tom Shoes. Anybody heard of Tom Shoes? All right. Oh, wow. Okay. Anybody bought anything at Tom Shoes? Obviously not that successful here in the UK. Tom Shoes. You buy a pair of shoes at Tom's. When you buy a pair of shoes at Tom's, they give a pair of shoes to someone in the developing world. It's an interesting thing now. But let's think about it in terms of categories, okay? Because we tend to think that businesses, organizations are grouped into different categories. Profit, not profit, right? What is Tom? Is Tom Shoes a charity that finances its charitable giving through shoe sales in the way that, school groups will financing their charitable giving through bake sales? I don't think it's not. It's not. Is it a company that's basically saying, you know what, we're going to limit our profit and do some good? I don't think it's that either, because it's a pretty attractive proposition. Gets more people to buy shoes. So what is it? What is this thing? You ask the founder of the company, and I'll give you his answer. His answer to what is this? He says, I should have put this quote up here. He says, we try to turn our customers into benefactors. Right, I don't know what that means either. All right? What I do think it means is that the categories are being disturbed. That is, we tend to think that businesses are typically about the profit motive, okay? And the profit motive is a good thing. I think it's good in efficiency terms. I actually think it's good in moral terms. But the profit motive isn't the only thing. What you see more and more is a rise of what you might call the purpose motive, is that more and more organizations want to have some kind of transcendent purpose, partly because it makes coming to work better, partly because that's the way to get better talent. And what we're seeing now is, in some ways, when the profit motive becomes unmoored from the purpose motive, bad things happen. Bad things ethically sometimes, but also bad things just like not good stuff, like crappy products, like lame services, like uninspiring places to work. That when the profit motive is paramount, or when it becomes completely unhitched from the purpose motive, it's just, people don't do great things. If you think about it, think about your own work, assuming that let's say all of you are incredibly talented people in high demand in labor markets. And your company says, okay, here we go, guys, we're ready to roll. This quarter, we are going to increase earnings per share by 2 cents. That is, for talent, that just doesn't make you want to get out of bed in the morning, race to work, and do something amazing. And I think more and more organizations are realizing this and sort of disturbing the categories between what's profit and what's purpose. And I think that actually heralds something interesting. And I think that organizations that are flourishing, whether they're profit, for-profit, or somewhere in between, are animated by this purpose model. Let me give you a couple of examples. Here's the founder of Skype. He says, our goal is to be disruptive, but in the cause of making the world a better place. Pretty good purpose. Here's Steve Jobs. I want to put a ding in the universe. All right? That's the kind of thing that might get you up in the morning and racing to go to work. So I think that, that we are purpose maximizers, not only profit maximizers. I think the science shows that we care about mastery very, very deeply. And the science shows that we want to be self-directed. And I think that the big takeaway here is that if we start treating people like people and not assuming that they're simply horses, slower, smaller, better-smelling horses, if we get past this kind of ideology of carrots and sticks and look at the science, I think we can actually build organizations and work lives that make us better off, but I also think they have the promise to make our world just a little bit better. So on that, let's take some questions.
Now, Dan, that was great. I've just got 3 questions, but I can't resist starting with, you said to me before we came in that you've dropped the story of the experiment with the candle and the book of matches, because everyone's heard it. I bet there's a lot of people who haven't heard it. And the reason I'm interested in you telling the story again is that when I heard you tell that story at TED in Oxford last year, what I got from that was that there's a kind of neurological process taking place here, that when you are driven towards, driven by a crude incentive, what it does is it drives you forward, and in a way it makes it harder for some reason for your brain to pick up lateral signals. So that's why it makes you dumber at complex cognitive tasks.
Absolutely.
So do you want to give is that right? And does that link to your bigger theory?
That's a great analysis of it. So essentially, well, there's a famous problem in experiment in psychology called the candle problem, where people are given a candle, a book of matches, and a box of thumbtacks, or drawing pins, right? I kind of like drawing pins better than thumbtacks. Box of drawing pins, candle, and some matches, and they're presented to them, and they have a wall right here, and they say, your job is to attach the candle to the wall so the wax doesn't drip onto the table. So what most people do is they take the drawing pins and try to stick the candle into the wall, which doesn't work. I, being far more intelligent than that, when I was presented this, I figured out the solution right away, which is to take the matches, melt the side of the candle so it's all gluey and viscous, and then adhere it to the wall. It's a brilliant conceptual maneuver that doesn't work. And eventually what happens is that people take the drawing pins, dump the drawing pins out of the box, put the candle into the box, and tack the box to the wall. Okay? It's a problem called functional fixedness. That is, we look at that box of drawing pins and see it only as a receptacle, but it can also be the platform for the candle. Well, there's a lot of experiments with this, and one of them showed that if you incentivize people to do this task, you have some people do the problem, try to solve the problem, you say, we're just timing you to establish norms, and you give people incentives for the other one, that the people offered the incentives will solve the problem more slowly. It'll take them longer to solve the problem, and it's exactly what Matthew's saying. It's because that kind of crude incentive gets your attention. If you say, I'll give you, I mean, you saw it in Jonathan 2's eyes there when I mentioned that there was 10 quid at stake here. He woke up. He was focused. You give somebody that kind of incentive, boom, you've got them. You've got them focused on the task. And if the answer is right ahead, that's a great cognitive position to be in because you're intensely focused on what's in front of you, and you can race toward it even faster. But as you say, that's the enemy of creative problem solving. Because if you're looking like this and you're trying to solve a creative problem, you're not going to get it because you're not picking up on the lateral signal. So in many ways, those if-then incentives, they don't work for creative tasks precisely because they work so well for the non-creative tasks. They're so good at focusing our attention, they actually are a detriment to more creative conceptual things.
So in that sense,
yeah.
Crude incentives could even be counterproductive because what they can mean is that you're less sensitive to things like risks, a lateral leap to innovation because you're being driven, which I mean, is it a huge leap of imagination to say that's one of the reasons we got into the banking mess we got into because there were so many people driven by bonuses and incentives who weren't picking up on kind of various messages they could have heard saying this whole thing.
Like the whole economy is cratering around you, yeah. Absolutely, and the other thing that's entirely right. What these crude incentives do is they limit the breadth of your thinking, so you're not picking up on the lateral signals, as you say. The other thing is that they foster, and there's evidence upon evidence upon evidence. They also focus a really intense form of myopia. That is, you're fixing straight ahead, but you're only fixated at the carrot that's dangling right out in front of you. If there's a grizzly bear 4 steps behind the carrot, you don't see it. You're fixated only on that. So it really boxes you in. The other thing on the financial stuff is that it's very clear empirically, I mean, in laboratory experiments, but also in our experience in the world, that if you offer very high stakes rewards for short-term goals, some people will take the low road there. It's actually, to me, it's surprising that not everybody takes the low road.
So I'm kind of convinced by the argument. I was convinced when I first heard it, and I managed to get hold of the book before it was published here. It's a great book. But the question is, why? Why is it that we have been so addicted to this crude account, simplistic account of motivation? You know, the obvious answer is that people in power don't want people to know that paying them more money is not going to improve their performance because it's kind of nice for them to be paid a lot of money. So, I mean, is it as simple as that? Because it seems to me that if this was a piece of information which suited people in power, we'd have all heard about it a lot earlier. You know.
That's a good. Well, I actually agree with that analysis that it doesn't suit people in power for a couple of reasons. The first thing is that this is how it's always been done, and so people are resistant to change in that. You basically, what's interesting about the examples is that it's very rarely kind of legacy incumbent companies doing this. It's more of the upstarts who are trying this new approach. The second thing is that we're faked out a little bit in that they work in the short term, okay? So if you say to somebody, and this goes to the people in power, if you're a manager and you say, all right, team, innovation bonus, whoever comes up with a great idea, a breakthrough product, I'll give you a 3,000-pound bonus. Well, what happens in response to that? Suddenly, everyone's working really hard. Oh, they're furious. I'm such a great leader, you think, you know? And of course, they're not producing anything valuable. But they work and they spark activity in the short run. The other thing is that they're easy. They're easy. This other stuff is a lot harder. And so if something is easy and works in the short term, and you've always done it, you know, there's a kind of a inertia baked right in there that's hard to come about.
Can I ask you finally, which might seem like a kind of bit of a left field question, but nevertheless, when you talk about these companies and the different ways of working, and you talk about a more sophisticated account of what motivates people, do you think that opens up problems about the kind of classic shareholder-stockholder model of companies, because shareholders are just driven by short-term profits. And that's not because they're bad people. That's just the way the stock market works.
Right.
You know, we've all got shares in our pension funds, everything else. And the people who manage those funds for us, you know, they just go to wherever they think the money's going to come. So do you think that there's a problem about the fact that the way in which we finance companies is driven by a very simplistic model of profit maximization and punishing companies for not profit maximizing?
I think it is a extraordinarily important, I think it's really a very, very important insight. I haven't quite worked it out, but I think that in many ways, this approach to motivation is in some ways incompatible with a publicly held company. Google is a publicly held company. It's sort of exempt from certain rules right now. But I think that it is, it might be fundamentally incompatible with this, with public held companies, where the pressures are always short-term and not long-term. And there's a danger of that. This is, I think, one reason why you have some companies going back to privately held. There's also evidence that shows that this is a foolish approach, too, in that I write a little bit about this research that shows that companies that spend the most time offering guidance on their quarterly earnings have, basically measure of resources and sort of executive time and money invested in producing materials and so forth. Companies that spend the most time offering guidance on most resources offering guidance on quarterly earnings have lower long-term growth rates. And yet, if an executive's only there for 18 months, he or she doesn't care. It's like, let's pop the stock price up, take my money and run. So that's a structural problem that we haven't reckoned with.